Good morning, BookTube. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I am joined as always by my special guest, The Highway, which will make an appearance every now and then with some tooting trucks and vrooming motorcycles, and who knows what else. I'm also joined by some interesting cloud cover, which is partly responsible for the more vampiric complexion than usual that you might be seeing on the screen. We'll see if it leads to a sudden breakout of thunderstorm activity. That will be fun. This whole backdrop, though, ties in beautifully to what I want to talk about today. You might be able to see the screen, in which case you will see that I have placed a little image with a title and my name associated with it. That's because I decided to start serially publishing a novel on Patreon, and it is a complete novel for which I have been searching for representation. Serial publication's a different affair. It's only the first 2 chapters are free to read, and there's audio to go with the chapters if you for some reason want to hear me actually dictate the book to you. It is a complete work, and it is the first of a trilogy, A Fertile Source of Ruin. I'm serially publishing it in part to raise interest, in part to affirm that interest is there, because it has been a difficult, frustrating journey to finding representation for a work of space opera. I knew it would be, but definitely it's a very strange field right now. There are certainly a lot of people who enjoy reading these kinds of works, but there are very few agents who are interested in them, who list that they are interested in classic science fictional subgenres at this moment. And yet, I really stand by this story. I think the story that I have written is something that makes a lot of sense to share in the current world that we are living in. I wrote it out of direct reflection upon the world that we are living in. It is a wartime space opera, which is not the same as a military sci-fi. It is set in war. It is reflecting on war. It is reflecting on history and culture and civilization within war. And so, unsurprisingly, it is inspired by Thucydides. It is inspired by the Peloponnesian War, which is one of our most foundational Western texts when it comes to depicting the psychology and the political mechanics of diplomacy in peace and in war. Thucydides very much admired the civilization that had cast him out, essentially, oddly enough. He was a general in the war, and then he was kicked out when his fleet failed to arrive in time to hold off a Spartan advance. And so this Athenian by title and association, though not entirely, he also has Thracian roots, was essentially thrown into exile, and in exile focused on writing this work. And this work has a lot of pragmatism to it. It is not a pure glow-up of different figures, but it still has partiality to many notions of the nation and many notions of political genius or celebrity that show up in some of the choices made throughout. Nonetheless, very pragmatic in terms of his depiction of how we create notions of nation, how we create notions of society. It's just that his depiction of Athens and Sparta on the verge of war, and then through this very messy, complex war, which embroiled so many other figures in the moment, and then led to plague as well at certain times and a whole bunch of suffering on many levels, is something that could have been lifted from headlines today. Because human beings do not change. 2,400 years ago, we acted a certain way, we saber-rattled, we were driven by ego, we had these rationalizations for how our civilization, surely being the superior form of governance, needed to do what it took to stay in power and to continue to hold dominance in the region. And Athens and Sparta were very different powers in some ways. one of them a little bit more conservative, a little bit more land-bound, a little bit more focused on hierarchy and how it controlled things in a very rigid way. The other one more interested in ruling through mercantile relationships, but which had the force of law behind them. And yet, despite the differences between the two, there are many similarities as well. And a lot of Westerners often don't realize how similar they are, because we have been given this myth, Athens, the birthplace of democracy. And we now know that's not true. It probably happened in Uruk a lot earlier. And it probably happened in a better way in Uruk. These ancient civilizations, now that we have uncovered more of the archaeological evidence of those earlier sites, we see that there were actually forums that would allow for more people in the community to gather, which is what you need to be able to talk together, to vote together, to do anything communally. Athens was a much more elitist society in many ways, and with some very fascinating systems of patronage that underlie the history even of the last couple of generations leading to the war. So you had certain small c conservative figures, I don't want to conflate them with conservatism today, but differently conservative figures who nonetheless had a very interesting notion of how to do good for their community, to support their community, to provide welfare for the community with the spoils of war, and had different approaches to the glory of war. So a much more complex array of quote-unquote conservative publicans. And you also had many figures who might be considered radical, might even be considered people who created progress, who advanced the cause of democracy, opening it up so that different classes of people could eventually vote, but they themselves gained office in part through their affluence and through the use of their affluence to serve as patron for the arts. So, long way of saying, our notion of Athens as a democracy is probably as sound as our notion of democracy as a functional enterprise today. And amid it all, we have these histories that are told to elevate figures, to elevate the notion of the nation, to elevate notions of one society's superiority over the other, which don't necessarily reflect well on the reality. And so in my piece, I have used a space operatic format to play out certain aspects of the Peloponnesian War that best highlight some of the mistakes that we continue to make when it comes to ego, to warmongering, to justifying our warmongering, to justifying our societies, to acting as though, if we don't have indentured servants by name, then clearly we don't have slaves in our society. These notions of nationalism and how they can brew quite quietly and insidiously in the background until we do something about them. So, the long and short of it is that there is this work which is going to be serially published on Patreon as I am continuing to look for an agent for it and the rest of the trilogy, which reflects on histories of war. It involves a war between a version of Athens and Sparta, obviously space-flung in this dark-eyed nebula. And I have also crafted in the middle of the story, which is one half of it is being told by my Thucydides character, someone who has told the story of this war one way for a long time, and now finally, while dying in cryostasis, is made to confront some of the underlying flaws in the logic of his notion of self and society. Against this, there is a storyline that was plucked and very much fleshed out in a more creative, inventive way from the tragedy of Melos, which informs the Melian dialogue. The Melian dialogue is one of the most famous passages from the Peloponnesian War. The other one might be Pericles' death oration, but we'll get to that in another time in another book. But the problem with Melos is that it was this little tiny island people that did not want to be involved in this great war that Athens wanted with Sparta, but Athens could not bear the thought of allowing anyone to stay neutral. It might cause problems when trying to put pressure on other allies, so it threatened to destroy the island if the island did not take its side and join it in the war effort, and Melos preferred to uphold its neutrality to test what Athens claimed to be its higher virtues that it was defending with warmongering at all. And Athens proved itself to be very much not the upstanding moral pillar that it's often presented as in our history, by slaughtering the people of Melos to serve its war interests. The profound hypocrisy from a people that considers itself righteous. I think there are plenty of things in today's news that resonate with that unfortunate truism throughout history. Humans in society act in these ways, and they have acted in these ways for thousands of years. My Melos doesn't completely die. The civilization, the small outpost, is slaughtered, but there was a world ship that was doing experiments away from the main base at the time. It's a scientific utopian community, and so this ship of scientific utopians continues to exist and has a privileged status in the war after, because after the destruction of Melos there's a little bit of shame, and so there's a little bit of a saintly character that's placed upon this crew, sort of like the Walking Dead. Nobody really wants to touch them or approach them, but they'll let them go about their business. And so the people of the ship, the Shield, have become the humanitarians in the middle of the war. They become kind of a Red Cross outfit that is there to clean up the messes, help refugees get to safety, recover people from all sides indiscriminately, helping whomever needs their aid, and in that way they maintain their neutrality. So the story follows my Thucydides character, who has to unlearn his history so that he can relearn the true site of power and the deeper underbelly of hypocrisy in the Stark-Eyed Nebula, and that will take place not just through this first book, but through the next two as well. And this other ship, which is trying to maintain a kind of neutrality still. It's trying to stay above the nationalist fray. It's trying not to fall victim to the same political impulses that have shaped the destiny of others around it, but that is very hard to do when it is under constant pressure to perform a certain role and otherwise try to navigate freely within this complex ongoing war that is nearing its end, with Sparta about to come out victorious, just as in real life. Although Sparta does not have much time in power before it too collapses in a different way. And Athens collapses for reasons that have a lot to do with an internal destruction of its own democratic system, which again resonates so much with what's going on in the world today. If it's not clear, it should be clear by now. I'm frustrated that it's not that easy to find a home for this piece, simply because sometimes you write what you feel best reflects the moment and its needs, and yet you serve a very regional, small publishing universe. And I've talked about this before. Our science fiction world is regional. It is small, even if it aspires to speak grand truths and to be universal. Most of the prominent publishers that we have are very much interested in what is resonating with workshops and conference calls and reader interests in a few niche spaces. You've got Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, a lot of spaces that have their own trend cycles and their own preoccupations and their own way of doing discourse. And one other problem, obviously, with my work, this has always been a problem with my work when it comes to publishing, is that I don't take the point of view that the reader should always be reassured that they know what is correct. There should be doubt and uncertainty, and there should be caution around characters having very strong subject positions that kind of scapegoat or flatten those around them. It is important to have a views in tension and to have deconstructions of views on the page is important work to inviting us as readers to deconstruct our own preconceptions about our societies, our histories, and so forth. So there is a tone in the story between Thesmos, the team lead on the ship, who is trying to stop a very subtle form of nationalism from rising before it becomes a real problem, while managing with the rest of her crewmates the latest crisis of refugees that have landed, survivors of a raiding attack. And on the other hand, this historian who is arguing with an AI construct in his head from when he was a general, sort of a strategic program that was embedded in him when he was serving with Athens in a military capacity, and which has been with him ever since, goading him, baiting him. Their conversations are much more philosophically driven. They're much more historiography driven. They're about challenging these views that he's had, and they do involve reflecting on war and politics and political maneuvering, but not necessarily in the most exciting, dramatic, action-forward way that many other novels might take. And that there are plenty of authors who do this. Just for some reason, I'm not the right author, right place, right time to pull a Neil Stephenson or a Kim Stanley Robinson or others who have been able to be steadfast about this, or even a Becky Chambers, who benefits, of course, from some geopolitical positioning, to write those kinds of speculative stories that are more philosophical. Long way of saying that these are considerations I kept in mind when deciding, you know what, I'm just going to start serially publishing this piece on Patreon because I stand by it, and I think it matters. I think it's important for the world we're living in. And the first 2 chapters are free to read. After that, you can sign up for as low as $1 a month to be able to read the rest. And I will still be looking for representation for it as a full text and the series, but if that representation doesn't come out in the next a few months, who knows? Again, there are very few agents who do or support this kind of work right now. Then I guess I'll be resigned to indie publishing. This leads to the second point that I wanted to make. There's another reason I just don't care anymore, and I hate to be very frank about that, but sometimes I just get so exhausted moving through speculative fiction as a genre when thinking about the tension between what we are doing on the page and what we are aspiring toward in real life. The real world is in a lot of pain. Our societies are not doing well on many levels. We are in the middle of a polycrisis, and we, as human beings, individual little critters, don't fully process what that means. Maybe we can't. It's a lot to take in. We are watching our world destroyed actively by accelerating climate change and the lack of leadership to do what needs to be done about it. We are struggling from forms of rising extremist nationalism all across the globe in different ways, which we are fighting valiantly to keep down, but against more and more aggressive forms of cyber attack and also basic socioeconomic pressure among citizens, again, in some ways affected and stressed out by climate change and how it is increasing refugee rates, displaced rates around the world, creating more pressure points that lead to more xenophobic policies and more entrenched traditional small c or far-right conservative groupthink. It's frustrating. It's very painful. We've also been living through 2 wars, and we get to see not only the wars themselves play out, but the inhumanity of fellow human beings. I cannot tell you how ashamed I have been in the last few months to see the careful games that are played around vocabulary when one has a quote-unquote side, and because they have a quote-unquote side, they cannot acknowledge suffering on the other quote-unquote side at all, because it's a form of psyops that might undermine their path to victory. I see these things, and I see the same kind of warmongering, the same kind of flawed nationalist tendencies that undermined Athens and undermined in many other civilizations along the way. That sense of self-righteousness that whatever our side does is correct because it is our side, and it is in service to quote-unquote saving the higher ideals of our side, even if they must be sacrificed in the interim. It's so painful to see this play out over and over and over again. In my lifetime, especially, I am part of a cohort that saw this play out after 9/11, and now we're seeing it play out again across a few different theaters of war, but more importantly, not the theaters themselves, although there's horrific tragedy there, but in our reactions to them, the way that we politicize them, the games we play with human life everywhere else. I'm infuriated by it. On top of that, there are a lot of stressors on individual levels. I know that personally I moved through a lot of panic and insecurity, and I have still live in precarity. I still live in insecurity. I just don't care as much about it anymore either. So I see what's happening in speculative fiction in terms of these tempests and teapots, these latest scandals, these latest little problems with presses and so forth. And I think about how much of a disconnect a lot of our frantic energy is operating at in relation to the world that ostensibly the greatest parts of speculative fiction can and should serve. And I'm going to give some personal examples. Just this weekend. This weekend was a difficult one for contemplation because I had to cut ties with somebody I was helping for a few years. All through the pandemic, this person was out begging to try to support his 2 children as a single father, and it was a very hard situation, obviously, for everyone in pandemic, in the height of it, in the throes of isolation, lockdown, and for his work, it was very difficult for him to stay ahead. And at one point, I did start to help more directly once I realized some of the problems could be resolved by simply getting his license reinstated so that he'd get a different kind of job. And he tried his best. But while he and his children were living under a bridge for a bit, kicked out around Christmas, the youngest one contracted a very vicious form of leukemia. And it was very difficult to get him the care that his child needed, because there's a lot of exploitation. Shocking, I know. U.S. citizens thinking and listening to this, thinking, my goodness, a corrupt healthcare system? What? Anyway, long story short, for a couple of years, for a few months there, I was trying to help him and his kids get on solid ground. And then the other child died of probably malnutrition-related seizure, possibly getting hit by a car, but we don't know for sure. Just the body was so malnourished after a lot of really hard circumstances. And then the other one, despite surviving double lung leukemia, eventually died of complications from a viral load that had not fully been managed after months of paralysis. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to stay in contact with the father because the needs of this very grieving man were just too much at one point. But this past weekend, I know it was his first Father's Day with both his children gone, and that's a very heavy weight. And he's not alone. There are so many fathers whose Father's Days were very grim because of the number of children who've been killed in this last year. And not just killed directly. We can talk about violence from war, but we can talk about suffering, neglect, many treatable diseases, things that could be addressed with better social systems, healthcare systems. So a lot of negligent deaths. On the weekend as well, I have a lot of poverty in my neighborhood. Whenever I go out, there's always an ask for a little bit of coin, for a little bit of help. If I want to go to the discount grocery store nearest my apartment, there are always people out begging, and they have families. There's a mother with 2 little girls who are out these days, and she's definitely trying her best, but it's very hard. I've talked to her about her situation. She can barely keep rent at this point and she's trying to pay down a debt, a predatory loan that was taken out to protect her rent. So she's crawling out of awful interest, and as a result can barely afford anything else. When I do help them, I help them with rice, lentils. These days I keep a few bags of a few things on hand so that if my neighbors need something, I have some beans, rice, lentils, broth, some pastas and other things like that, so there's food to share. The little children, though, they came up to me after, and it wasn't one of those situations where like their mom's coordinating. Small children will ask things. They came up and they asked if I had any clothes, any children's clothes, because they wore the same things day in and day out, and they were really wondering if I had anything to spare. And they're just so small. I don't have anything. I don't have children's clothes on hand for the others. It just broke my heart, though, because it was a sincere ask. It was spontaneous, just they're living in profound discomfort and poverty and would just really like a change of clothes. I understand that. And also this weekend, I left in the middle of the rain, and to get some groceries, very simple, basic things, and I had a little bit of coin left. And as I was coming back to my apartment, there was a couple sitting in the rain, a young, very, very skinny man, and a young, slightly bigger woman. And they were just drenched outside this apartment because the apartment is filled with people who are more middle class, maybe have a little bit to spare. So it's worth it for them to sit out in the rain hoping that somebody will give them something. I gave them the coin I had, and the woman looked at me and she asked me the most extraordinary thing, which I had to say no to, obviously. But I just want you to think about the desperation that one must live with to ask such a thing. She told me she's 3 months pregnant. They have nowhere to live. She doesn't want the baby born on the street. If I just have even a small corner of my apartment that they could use, she doesn't want to give birth to a baby on the street. And I like the desperation of somebody to do that, and the openness, obviously. Obviously, I can't bring a family into my circumstances. And it's never just a little corner. No, it's a lot. It's a huge ask. As somebody lighter skinned, even without me speaking, people recognize that I am not from here, and therefore they associate that maybe I might have more money. Not always at all true. I'm very much in a precarious space as well, living frugally, managing as best I can. But I do live in an apartment building that is already of a different class than a lot of other people living in very humble means. But I knew at the same time, I went upstairs and I got some lentils and beans and so forth for them, because obviously they are neighbors in need, even if they're in different circumstances. And I asked about their circumstances. And what's happening here in Colombia is that there are a lot of paramilitaries, factions that have been forming up. Dissident FARC have gone so long as Dissident FARC that they now have these new names for themselves depending on territory and region, and they're in conflict with ELN as well. They're in conflict with a few cartels, Clan del Golfo, under its many different names, because different groups are also affecting a kind of political theater, even though they are very much a narco-trafficking outfit. It's very funny in some ways and sad in others. So in many parts of this country, there's internal displacement, and these two were internally displaced from a very dangerous, violent area. So now they're in the city, big city, hoping against hope. And I also told them about my network of friends on the street, because I make a lot of friends with the folks on the street. So I recommended a couple people to talk to about possible places to live. There might be a room available, somewhat cheaper, a lot cheaper actually in certain places, and some friendly faces and some materials and some things to help, because there is definitely a network, and poverty helps poverty. Sometimes. I don't want to say it as if every class is completely sainted or completely vilifiable. Everyone is. There are some good people who happen to be affluent, and there are some rough people who happen to be cash poor, and there are also a lot of good people just trying to get by and do the best they can. So, long aside, but it matters because I know I am a writer who performs a lot of professional labor within certain spheres, mainstream publishing, as an editor, as a writer of nonfiction, fiction, and eventually get some science fiction publishing again too. But sometimes I see what's going on in the world. I see what's going on in the news. I follow the news relentlessly, obviously. Not obviously, some people need a break from it, but for my labors it's important. And I live in a community with a lot of need. I live in a community with so much suffering. And I know my own, and I know what I crawled out of, and I know what I continue to try to crawl out of. And at the end of the day, what it comes down to is it leaves me with a sense of thankfulness to be able to do any of this higher level creative work at all, to have been able to write this book, to be able to pour out my frustration and my observations about the the nationalism, the warmongering, the vital historiography that we're not doing, the critical importance of being more aware of our cultures and what they really represent and whether our forms of government are actually upholding their best values. All of that is a class of labor that a lot of people can't even begin to engage with because they are moving through a lot. And they are dying and they are suffering through a lot. So when it comes to the end of the day, yeah, of course it's frustrating that I can't find an agent for my space opera. And at the same time, it just sounds so ridiculous to think in those terms. Writing, to my mind, is supposed to serve us. It is a tool. It's supposed to connect us. And the stories that we create are not supposed to be these lofty, grand products. They are supposed to be vehicles of connection, vehicles of providing some comfort, insight, understanding, clarity. And if the work is doing that, then that's enough. Should be enough. And everything else, all my other scrambles to try to quote-unquote make it, those come down to socioeconomic precarity. They come down to me trying to better my existence so that I can help others more, so that I can in the future be more of a support for others in turn. But it cannot be the end unto itself. The idea of the work for the work's sake is itself something that can only operate within a certain political context, because everything is political and everything comes down to whether we can just afford to get by. I worry, I know that things are not going to get easier for us, not as climate change continues to accelerate, and that leads to greater disasters, more intense temperatures, and affects our biochemistry, affects our stress levels, affects our capacity to reason our way out of knee-jerk fear and tribalism. It is going to get harder, and it's going to get harder a lot faster than I think most of us realize. We have to work harder in turn to try to maintain that humanitarian impulse, that humane sensibility, and try to ground ourselves when it comes to seeing the value of what we're doing as something disconnected from the communities in which we are operating and living. That at least is what I strive to do with my work, and that's why I've taken you on this little bit of a meander today. But it is another chaotic day in my neighborhood. Distribution trucks are backing and beeping into their warehouses to provide goods and services to others. And so I hope that this video provided a little bit of a service to you as well. It certainly did for me. Maybe I just needed to vent a little bit about it. If you want to read a wartime space opera, you are more than welcome to join me on Patreon and pick up what you can. There should be, I'm using different names for these characters, but you should get some fun cameos from history if you know anything about the era. And so maybe there'll be some delight along the way. There should be. Thank you for listening. Have yourselves a wonderful week ahead. Take good care of yourselves. Do what you can in your communities. Don't feel guilt-tripped if you can't do more. We can't all adopt a family, even if it asks for help on the street because one of the members is pregnant and wants a safe place for a baby. But do what you can, right? And be kind with yourself when you reach the limits of what is possible. We're all trying to do the best that we can, and that has to be enough for now. Cheers.